Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Art of Photography. My name is Ted Forbes, and today we're going to get into a little bit of a philosophical discussion here. Based on a couple episodes ago, we did a show on Vivian Maier, and I was pretty overwhelmed by the response and the discussions that came up in that show. And I thought it was pretty cool. And What's kind of difficult about doing a show, and particularly when I get questions in an email, is I really want to share those responses with the group as a whole and with everybody who watches this. And so that's a little bit of where our topic is coming from today. So what we're going to do is I'm going to get my notes and we're going to kind of deal with the philosophical question of what is art. And I want to put some parameters around that as we move forward in the shows we discuss: photography lit, famous photographers, even the how-tos, the stuff that's making you a better photographer, all that stuff, because I think it's an important definition to have a grasp on. And before we get into that, I do want to give a reminder. If you didn't see the last video that we put out on Friday, we are now going to be adding some shows into the format here, and I'm really excited about that. So just really quickly, you can go watch that video if you want on the details. But we're adding 2 more shows that are going to be weekly. So this show will stay the same. There's no change there. The longer, proper podcast will come out every Sunday. The shows that we're adding are going to be a little bit shorter in length. They're going to be 3 to 5 minutes, maybe 6 minutes, somewhere in there. And the first one is going to be called Photo Threes. And the second one we're doing is kind of a question-answer show. And I'm really not sure what we're going to title it just yet, because I want to see how it goes and where it happens. But I'll be selecting questions that you guys have me, or discussion topics, kind of a request kind of deal. And those will be a little bit shorter, just so we can hit on some points in those. So anyway, without further ado, I want to discuss the definition of what is art, as odd as that sounds. So let me get my notes and we'll get going here. So we're dealing with this hypothetical, what is art anyway? And for those of you guys who don't know, I work in a museum for my day job. And I do a lot of multimedia production. And when I work with curators and educators in the kinds of content that we develop around objects in our collection that we have, it's really interesting because we've done audience surveys, and I think this is applicable just really in general to the public and the way they deal with art. And it's certainly shaped the way I've done this show over the last few years. And you know, one of the terms that, I mean, you know, like it or not, they exist, and I really don't like them, but when you're talking about high art and low art and, you know, the vernacular and then fine art, and these are just terms that people have put on things. And there certainly is, you know, this background of what personal interest is. So for instance, there are things that you like that somebody else may not. There are things that I like that you might not like. And, you know, there's personal opinion that comes into the equation. Personally, when it comes to photography, I am very fascinated with everything as a whole. You know, there's certainly photography I don't care as much for, but what fascinates me is I try to have a respect for everything, because I think the magic of what art can do for you is it can change your mind over time. And, you know, as time goes by, certainly there are things that I used to not care for at all that in retrospect now, a few years later, I see a little bit differently. And it's answering those types of questions and those types of relationships that you can have with art and artists that's what makes it interesting, is that opinions can change over time. They can also change the other way. Things you used to like, they're really not speaking to you in the same way anymore. But when defining what is art, I think it's important to remove the personal opinion from that a little bit, because I think what we define as art as a society is defined by the society. I know that really sounded redundant, but that's how it's defined. It's defined by a culture of people. It's defined by a collective opinion. And one other thing I want to add into this mix, and I mentioned the museum thing too, and one of the criteria that we look at is we kind of, at one point, if you analyze your audience kind of on this spectrum of people's relationship with art. And, you know, on one side of the continuum, you have people who have had art classes growing up in school. They might be artists themselves. They have a very solid and connected relationship with art, so that's one end of the spectrum. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have people who grow up without a whole lot of exposure to art. Maybe they really didn't have a lot of art classes in school. They just come from a different background. And the sad part is that on that side of the continuum, the willingness to participate in discussion, the willingness to feel comfortable, especially in a museum setting, is a lot less. Those people tend to hold back because they're afraid they're going to sound dumb, or they're not going to sound intellectual enough, and it's really too bad. And that's one of the things that, you know, certainly on the show, I try to take into consideration. I don't know if I do it successfully or not, but even with the museum that I work at, that's one thing we try to take into consideration when doing programming, because we want people to feel welcome and have that kind of experience. So, I think when you come up with these definitions, it's really important to understand, especially when you're talking to other people, that there are no right or wrong answers to any of this stuff. It's a collective opinion. It generates discussion, and I think that's part of the magic of it and kind of the cool thing that comes about. But for our sake here, what I want to talk about are when we look at art or we look at photography, and I really don't like the term good photography or bad photography, even though, truth be known, we all use those terms. But, how can we take the self out of that a little bit and come up with a definition? Because, you certainly can have a 3-year-old drawing stick figures of their family on a piece of pudger paper, and that is art, and it's beautiful, and it's awesome, and it's also a common thing that everybody does, hopefully, when they're a kid. So it's not really it's something that stands out. It's not on this tier that Picasso and when I say tier, it doesn't mean that it's better or worse. It's just for some reason. What is the difference between that and a Van Gogh, or the difference between that, and put it in photography terms? What's the difference between just taking a snapshot and somebody like Ansel Adams, who came and changed things, in a very impactful way, or Henri Cartier-Bresson, or Robert Frank, or insert photographer's name here? What is that difference? And for me, I think there's 3 criteria. I have my notes here to consider when how that's defined. And I think that if we want to use the term good art for a second, and I know that's just a label, but what does that mean? I think there's 3 criteria that define that. One is, I think there's a display of style, technique, discipline. There is something that, and again, I'm bringing this back into myself here, but I think most people, there's something that we can't do that we're impressed by. And whether that's a technical issue or whether that's a stylistic issue, maybe somebody, it's like what they're doing isn't that advanced, but they've got such a style to what they do. And there's a lot of photographers in that category, like minimalism, or just even like somebody like Bresson, who had this wonderful ability within this decisive moment to capture things a certain way that I don't do well, or you don't do well, or somebody, so that's, it's a talent thing, but it's a little bit of the Olympic metaphor. We all like to watch the Olympics every 4 years because it's people doing these outstanding athletic ability related activities and competing with one another, and there's something very impressive about that. And I think that does exist within art too, whether it's a technical thing, whether it's a stylistic thing, whether it's just a vibe that somebody is really good at creating, whatever that is. I think that's number one. Number two, and this is really important too, is I think work that tends to have more success and that speaks to people is something that challenges and questions basic human needs and desires. So things like hope, desire, freedom, something that gives you something to think about on a little bit higher level. I think pop music, especially stuff you hear on the radio, suffers so much right now because it's art in a sense that's created to either dance to or improve your mood or be happy or relax. And quite frankly, there's a place for that and there's nothing wrong with that, but it's quite boring if that's all we have. I think it's really important to have art that challenges those notions somewhat. And then the final thing, and I think this is really important too, is there has to be, for things to stand the test of time, a place and time of cultural and historic significance, at least the cultural end of it. If you look at movements in art or movements in photography, Juliet Margaret Cameron, certainly, trailblazing into what became pictorialism, there's a real, that's part of what makes that really solid because it has cultural and historical significance that go along with it. I think even war photography, particularly stuff from World War II, Vietnam, the Robert Cappas, just the amazing photographers that came from that era that challenged the way we think about those things. And I think that that's important as well. And so, all those 3 things kind of are what goes into defining, again, I don't like the term, but good art, or art that has substance to it, or art that speaks. And sometimes those are removed from someone's personal feelings. Like certainly there's things that I don't care for because aesthetically it turns me off, but from a, just an integrity perspective, I have to respect it on a certain term because it does fit into some or all or most of that criteria. So I hope this makes sense, and I hope that what I want to get out of this is I want to get a discussion going and a little bit of a dialogue. So I hope you guys will consider leaving comments below in this, because I think it really is important. Another thing that actually came out of the Vivian Maier thing too, it became a discussion that a couple people had asked me about, and it came up in the comments. And actually in the Vivian Maier film, which I'll do a separate review on, John Maloof, who is the guy who's in charge of her estate and basically dealing in her photographs and making a lot of money, but anyway, beside the point, he makes this kind of apologetic line in there that the art world has not caught up with Vivian Maier. They're not willing to accept her yet, and he talks about taking these images to MoMA and the Tate, and that they weren't interested. And that is such a generalized response to that, because there's so much that goes into museums and collections. You have museums on one hand, you have art galleries on one hand. I really don't think that the Tate would be interested. I mean, they deal in British artists, and you have MoMA, which is not in the business of unknown street photographers at all. So I don't think those are really good examples of places that should have been taken. I think there are other museums who would be interested in something like Vivian Maier. But you look at a museum versus an art gallery and how this fits into the whole art world, not just Vivian Maier. But the goal and the mission behind most art museums is to preserve cultural objects, things that have had significance, things that meet that criteria we just talked about. And so sometimes, if it's an unknown artist or an unknown acquisition, sometimes that's a harder argument to make as to whether the exhibition budget is going to go into purchasing a collection like that. So, and I realize that, that process is kind of behind closed doors, and there's a lot that goes into it, and it's different from museum to museum. But I think it's safe to say that most museums are on that playing field of what they're going to look for in something. It doesn't mean it's not well defined as art, and it doesn't mean that it's not culturally significant. It can be a variety of things. It's unknown. Another thing, too, that's really key to a lot of museums is provenance. And that basically means the paperwork that proves that you actually own something. And there's been a lot of stuff in the news in recent years about acquisitions, particularly coming out of Eastern Europe, Egypt, places like that, that can be traced back through a series of legitimate sales to actually a theft at one point. And it's a very sad thing, and when you start legally arguing that in a court of law, it is very possible that you have to return objects even though you may have paid for them a lot. So museums are careful about stuff like that. But anyway, on the other hand, you also have art galleries. And art galleries, it's weird, the relationship between a museum and a gallery, because a gallery is probably going to be, and they run the gamut, but the bottom line with an art gallery as far as its mission goes is to sell work. That is what they are in business for. They're not really a nonprofit organization. They're looking for sales. So it's a fine line that they walk between something that, say, has commercial appeal to it and something that fits into our criteria we talked about as being culturally significant, impressive on some level for technical or stylistic ability, and then also challenging certain questions. And sometimes it takes, and this is the problem with art too, is sometimes things come up and they're way ahead of their time, and it does take a while for them to really gain the respect and acceptance that they probably deserve. So I hope this is making sense. I'm going to use two examples here too, because if we're talking about defining art and when it deserves success in its place, I think that there's certainly, looking back over the years at certain exhibitions I've seen, things I've seen in person, there are some wonderful photography exhibits that I've seen, and I can recall. And actually, one of my favorites was, I believe it was the Robert Jackson is the guy's name. It was a collection, and this was an exhibition that the National Gallery in Washington put together, almost 10 years ago. And it was a collection. The title of the exhibition was Snapshots, 1888 to 1978 or something like that. And I'll see if I can find a link anywhere online and put it in the show notes. But what's interesting is this was simply a collection of snapshots based on the premise that anybody with a camera probably has the ability to capture something interesting at some point, whether accidentally or whether intentionally. And a lot of these photographs were collected out of thrift stores, auctions, and so there's a real sense of, the photographer behind them is really pretty anonymous because we don't know who took the shots, and it's an entire show of this. It was an extremely impressive show. It was a very beautiful show. And I think that it really bridged a gap between what sometimes people call vernacular or lower art or just snapshot variety of stuff. And, I've had discussions with folks this week, and they've talked about, we're in the Instagram generation, and the value of a picture is like, it's instant and everything goes quick and it gets old like pop music. And I think that a lot of that is true. And I certainly don't aspire to professional levels when I do my own Instagram contributions, but Instagram has a place, and it really is part of that snapshot culture, that vernacular. And doesn't mean that it's bad, it doesn't mean that it's good, but what's interesting is what time will do with the significance of these things. It may do nothing, it may do a lot. It may be that somebody does a show called, rather than Snapshots 1888 to 1978, there's Instagram photos, 2012 through whatever, and that will be interesting to see over time, and time's the only thing that can bring that around. So anyway, just to summarize this, I know this is a little bit of just a lot of me talking today in this episode, but I really want to bring that up because it's so funny, the variety of answers and opinions that I get in comments and stuff, and I'm not trying to unify that at all, but I wanted to discuss this because I like that discussion and I hope to keep that going. So I hope you guys would leave a comment or feel free to send me an email. And it could be that what we'll do is we'll wrap this up into the Q&A show that we're going to be doing on Fridays now. So anyway, please do so if you're remotely interested at all. So anyway, once again, guys, that's it for today. This has been another episode of The Art of Photography, and I want to thank you guys for watching. I'll see you next week. Later.